in here. Oh, we have a customer who's moving. Oh, okay. Can people come up, fill in the front row, please? Fill in the front row, please. Thank you very much. David's filling in the front row. Thank you very much. Mike Barry's right there, right where we need him. Come right up to the front row, please.
Why so many chairs? It should be close. It should be round table.
Well, some people, not everyone's done it, but at least we got some people coming. We can just keep this seat.
Those in the back row, please come to the front, or you have to listen to Jeff Brown's speech twice. That's the punishment.
KPC is back on, right? KPC is fully on as a rotator client now, right?
Always will.
Yeah, okay. Oh, there's only KPC.
Sure, there's no danger at all.
We've got some questions for you.
Okay, go ahead. I'm just here sitting for form, but it's your charge.
Should I go ahead then?
Yes, please.
Okay, if everyone could have a seat in the front row, we will kick off here. This is a special session. It's meant to be discussion-oriented. This is a topic that we receive a large amount of questions on, and I think there's a lot of potentially misinformation out there. So we're going to try to clarify some things. Cuneyt is the head of our demand forecasting and handles all of our demand side work at FGE. So he heads it globally. He aggregates up all our different work that we do in terms of oil product demand throughout all the various regions. He's in charge of it. Electric vehicles are near and dear to his heart. So I'm going to turn it over to him right now to tell us, what is it, the real truth about electric vehicles?
Real truth, yeah.
Yes. Please go ahead, Cuneyt.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for joining us here, actually. Thank you very much for having me here. And thank you very much actually being here, because I appreciate it's a very difficult session. The first one after lunch, second day, so great to see that crowd. So the topic what I'm going to talk about is basically electric vehicles and their impact on oil demand, to what extent, where, and so on. Let's give it a try. So the main question, I want to give you a couple of keywords here before we start, actually. And my presentation will go around these keywords. Transport, motorization, policy, growth, transformation, heavy duty, ride-hailing, fuel economy, uncertainty. So these are the keywords that we are going to talk around this session, basically. And by the end of my presentation, we hopefully will have filled in the gaps in this slide. Let's go on. Let's have a very top-level overview. This is our global oil demand outlook by FGE. We see the global oil demand in our base case to go to up to around 115 million barrels a day by 2040. So about 15 million barrels a day growth compared with today. But what you get here actually is also a big uncertainty over the next 20 years or so. You see the blue cone around the line. In the high case, we go to over 130 million barrels a day. There's a likelihood that oil demand peaks at 108 million barrels a day, but I personally think that this likelihood is relatively small. Now, we are going to talk about electric cars and all this type of stuff, but why are we talking about electric cars? What's the matter behind this, actually? You can see we have seen this chart actually in the earlier session as well. Transport, road transport, accounts for almost half of global oil demand. That's what makes it so important, actually. And more importantly, we expect that the majority of the global demand growth will come from the transport sector, from road transport sector. Of this 15 million barrels a day that I mentioned earlier, about 8 million barrels a day is road transport, 4 million barrels a day is jet. Petrochemicals will grow 5-6 million barrels a day. So that's where what the fate of this 8 million barrels a day will be. To what extent electrification will affect this? It's a big question. When we talk about electric cars, of course, we talk about income and car ownership, consumer preferences, etc. Look at this chart. On this chart, you can see the relationship between vehicle density, car ownership, and per capita income, personal income levels. Each dot on this chart is a country. And you can see, yes, there are outliers also, but you can see a nice pattern here. It says basically from $8,000 to $10,000 per capita income, motorization rate starts surging. It peaks around $35,000 per capita income. Now, why is this range very important, actually? Because of this. Here you see the main regions and where their per capita income will be over the next 20, 25 years. And what you can see is, look at North Africa, non-OECD Asia. They have just surpassed this threshold, this critical threshold. That's why we think that these regions are actually somewhere at the beginning of this big hike, big surge. And over the next 20 years or so, they will climb up here. And we'll see a big growth in motorization rates. And they will catch up with the developed world, basically, with the industrialized world. Look at this chart. A little bit methodology behind our model, basically. So we have modeled the world's top 25 vehicle markets, accounting for about 91% of the global vehicle fleet in our database. Some of the countries are listed here. And you can see the gap, basically. USA is totally another world. I'm not saying anybody will reach these levels. But look at this gap between the Asian countries. China, India here, right now about 50. We'll see it going to 100. China, it's about 100 per 1,000. Now we'll see it tripling to 300. But even by 2040, look where South Korea is, for example. Look where Japan or Australia is, peer Asian countries. So what this indicates is that there is actually a huge catch-up potential, huge gap to close between these developing countries, aspiring countries, with the developed countries. And this gives us basically, with other factors included as well, our outlook for the global vehicle fleet. So we see it growing from 1.1 billion to 1.8 billion or so. Most important thing you have to get from this chart is basically this dark blue area, Asia. 500 million new vehicles, new cars coming on the road in Asia over the next 25 years. Today, 1 out of 3 cars in the world is driven in Asia. By 2040, every second car in the world will be driven in Asia. Every second car in the world will be driven in Asia. Now, when we talk about electrification, look at electrification, etc., we look obviously at a variety of factors here. Some less important, some more important. Starting from the least important, actually, some other factors like SUVization, oil prices, etc. After that comes production capacity, which affects obviously vehicle production capacity, also battery production capacity. Speaking about batteries, obvious factor, battery technology. Infrastructure problems, charging points, and all this type of stuff. But the key factor, the most important factor, is government policy, subsidies. This is the single most important factor in electrification. Forget the rest, really. It's the government policy that drives the electrification. Let me show you this chart. This is Norway. A very recent analysis appeared in Norwegian press. I caught up with this yesterday, actually, and put this chart in my presentation. It compares for a standard commuter in Oslo region, diesel car versus electric car cost. So annual cost, about 45,000 Norwegian crowns with diesel car. Electric car costs about 10,000 Norwegian crowns, massive saving. But massive savings. But look at where the savings come from. Car tax and tolls, fuel tax. The actual net fuel bill is pretty much not there, no advantage. So this basically, in Norway, 82% of the cost saving of electric cars come from subsidies. And this is a very important thing. This is Norway, very rich country, very small country, and even there more than 80% of cost savings come from subsidies. Why is this important? Because we have a couple of examples. That's a new story, actually, electrification, but we still have a couple of examples about when subsidies, what happens when subsidies get removed. Georgia in the US, subsidy removal, electric car market crashes, never recovers. Denmark in Europe, subsidy removal, car market crashes, never recovers. Even in China, uncertainties around subsidies cause serious disruptions in the electrification rates. Of course, the problem with the mass electrification is when somebody buys a $100,000 Tesla, the subsidies is peanuts for him. But if you want to go for mass electrification with cheaper cars, subsidies can make up to a third of the car purchase price. It's very important. And looking at the China, actually, why do you think it recovers after these crashes? Again, it's the policy, because of mandate. It's mandated. So without any mandate, China will be like this, basically. It's very important, very important. Let me move to the next factor, infrastructure. These are some lines which we have come up with looking at our own battery electric vehicle forecast. And we looked at it and how many charging points we would need and what the cost of these charging points will be in different scenarios. That's what we looked at. And basically, you can see in different type of, 10 vehicles per charging point, 5, 15 vehicles. The cost, the number you get is between 30 and 80 million charging points globally. Right now, it's about 300, 400,000. The cost of it is various level 2, level 3 combinations, supercharger, normal charger combinations. The cost is between 400 billion and $1 trillion. These are just scenarios, so I'm not saying that these things will happen, but it shows that the charging infrastructure, how big of a challenge the charging infrastructure is. And look at these things, actually. In order to improve access for vehicles, 100% reliance, the new policy reserves the city's EV charging stations for battery-only electric vehicles. All other vehicles, including plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, blah, 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 blah. This is from Beverly Hills Municipality press release last month. What they say is if you have a plug-in hybrid vehicle, you are not allowed to use the public charging point. Go home. Look at this. It was all over in the press. The press gets really hyped by this. Shell has announced last month they will put a couple of charging points into Shell stations in the UK. Introductory price, the normal price will be 50 pence per kilowatt hour. We did the math. At 50 pence per kilowatt hour, filling your gasoline car's tank is cheaper than charging your electric car. How does this add up? Look at this. Tesla hikes EV supercharger rates across US, doubles them basically. We did the maths again. Now using supercharger in the US, cost per mile equal to the gasoline car. So the entire cost advantage of the electric car is gone basically. What do these things say basically to you is put in simple words. Do not buy an electric car unless you can charge it at home. This is the message of the policymaker. So don't wait for the charging points in the cities and on the highways and stuff like this. They will not come. They will not come in sufficient volumes. But this is, of course, another problem. I live in London. I live in an apartment, second floor. I don't have off-street parking. What am I going to do if I buy an electric car? Put the extension cable through the window, through the garden, over the pavement to the car? People do this. I've seen a couple of times, actually. It's really dangerous, and it's actually illegal. Battery production capacity, another problem. So you see here actually what's announced projects of battery production and what is needed to fulfill our own battery electric vehicle outlook. To fulfill our very own FG's battery electric vehicle outlook, battery production capacity should grow 20-fold until 2040. 20-fold. we'll need about 70 new Tesla gigafactories. Massive investment requirement. Massive challenge. And of course, this is just our own battery electric vehicles. Remember, lithium-ion batteries are not just used for electric cars, for everything else. And even in the transport sector, if you want to go to bus electrification, you basically replace 6 cars. If you want to go to truck electrification, 1 Tesla truck basically takes out 25 Nissan Leafs from the road. And if you want to go actually to Norway, they have these Norwegian ferries, electric ferries and stuff like this. 50 Nissan Leafs. So if you want to go with your electrification beyond the car segment, actually, it causes you an enormous amount of money to put all these battery production and also time, etc., etc. It's a big challenge there as well. Vehicle production capacity. Feridun has shown this chart in his opening presentation, basically. Today's car production capacity is about 76 million units per year. 40 million of this is coming from 4 brands only. And look at where the electric car manufacturers is. So they are in the headlines, I give you that. When you open some news outlets, all you need is electric car manufacturers, but they are not in the market, they are not in the mass market. And the main problem is actually this. Look at this. Nissan, Renault, Mitsubishi's CEO, I have big admiration for him. He's one of the best managers in the automobile business. Carlos Ghosn is going to all with investment 4 billion euros, 5.6 in electric vehicles. That will give Renault Nissan capacity to build 500,000 electric vehicles. This is annually, and batteries at 11 factories in 8 countries. What would you say was the time of this? Any wild guesses? By 2013. This is from the target of Nissan Renault in June 2011. Now, 500,000 electric vehicle production capacity. How much of this they have actually managed to get? Since 2010 until end of 2017, cumulative electric production capacity of Nissan Renault is 540,000. Cumulative, not annual. Cumulative. This shows you, when you look at these car manufacturers and they come up with things like, oh, by 2025, half of our fleet, half of our production will be electric, and all this type of stuff. Take this with a pinch of salt. It's not so easy. SUVization. SUVs is a big problem for electrification, actually. Look at this. SUV share in new registrations, world's top 3 car markets. US, Europe, China. US, 70%. Europe, 1/3. China is going to 50% now. And why is this so important? Because look at this chart. SUV versus plug-in sales in top 3 markets. In these top 3 markets, for every plug-in car coming on the road, between 20 and 60 SUVs come on the road. For every plug-in car, 20 and 60 SUVs. Do you read about the SUVs in the press? Hardly. Do you read about the electric vehicles? Always. Between these 3, 2017 electric vehicle sales have increased by 50%. Big growth. SUV sales have increased by 9% only. But obviously, the idea is the SUV sales have given you the much bigger numbers of fleet. And this is actually what matters, the absolute growth, not the percentage strong growth in the fleet. Let me give you a real-life example about this, actually. Gasoline demand growth with electrification, California. What do you think when you hear about California? Apart from mamas and papas and Haight-Ashbury and so on. Cumulative zero-emission vehicle sales in the US. Over the last 5 years, half of the zero-emission vehicle sales, electric car sales, in US have happened in California. Half of them. California and then the rest of the US. 50-50. When you look at a picture like this, what will you think? Gasoline demand in California should be tanking, isn't it? Is it? It actually has been increasing now over the last couple of years. Why is that? Well, we all know. I mean, you look at the years there. You can make up your mind. Obviously, gasoline price has come down, even in California, where it's most expensive in the US, and the mileage has increased. So basically, people have driven more, and the gasoline demand has increased. But also contributing to this is this. California light vehicle fleet by fuel. Look at this. So these are the zero-emission vehicles, the light blue ones, and the conventional fleet, gasoline fleet. Zero-emission vehicle sales in California have increased over the last decade by 35% per year. 35% every year, 35%. Whereas the conventional fleet has increased by just 1% per year. You read all about the 35% in the press. 35% gives you 250,000 vehicles by the end of this line, growth. 1% growth over the last decade gives you 3.3 million. Well, you can make up your mind regarding the impact on oil demand. And this is a crucial point in analyzing the impact on electric vehicles on oil demand. Absolute growth is what matters, not the percentage growth. Of course, when you say about, look at this, you would say, okay, I mean, there's now a huge gap here. One day the electric cars will catch up with the conventional fleet. I mean, how long does it take? To analyze this, actually, we looked at some transformation stories in the car industry. Electric vehicles is nothing unique, actually. So this type of transformation disruption in the car industry has happened before. It's not the first time. Look at this. Brazilian flex fuel car sales. Before 2000, nothing was there. 2003, it started surging. In 5 years, car sales reached 90%, just in 5 years. And then it took another 10 years to make half of the fleet flex fuel in Brazil. Now, why is that? Why did it go so fast? Basically, government policy, oversupply of ethanol, no technical problems. A flex fuel car is technical, the same car as a gasoline car. Ethanol is a little bit more corrosive, so you change a couple of parts, and a little bit software adaptation is required, but that's it. And no infrastructure problems. Petrol stations were already there. Another change, this is not directly engine related, but cars with driver's side airbags in the US. All right? Took 15 years to reach 90%. And look how long it took, more than 30 years, to make the entire car fleet in the US equipped with driver's side airbags. Another transformation very close to here, very important for Middle Eastern refiners actually, European dieselization. Starts in the 80s, climbs from 10% to over 50% within 20 years, and then hovers between 50 and 60% for another decade. And remember, this happens, government policy is there, diesel is cheaper. No infrastructure problems, service stations are all there. No technological constraints, diesel engine is already a mature engine. And still after 3 decades of dieselization, the majority of the cars in Europe are gasoline driven. Would you believe this? The majority of the European fleet is gasoline driven. Now, when you see these examples, of course, you can make up your mind how long it will take, basically, with the electrification. You see here the electric car sales now, and then you see here the electric car fleet now. And this is our base case outlook, basically. Electric car sales gradually climbing to 30% by 25–30% by 2040, and their share in fleet, 10%. 10% by 2040, battery electric vehicles. Of course, when you come to this level, you can always say governments have means to accelerate these transformation rates. One thing they can do is banning cars, banning internal combustion engine. There's been a lot of talk about this in the UK recently. UK is going to ban internal combustion engine by 2040 or so. So I'm showing you basically 2 columns with some monetary values, 75 billion euros here, 280 billion euros there. Any wild guesses what these are? All right. EU tax revenues from tobacco, transport fuels. So tobacco kills every year 700,000 people in Europe. Diesel is said to be responsible for the deaths of 10,000 people. Transport fuel revenues, 4 times higher than the tobacco. Have you ever heard of any government in the world that has totally banned tobacco? Why not? Its detrimental impacts on health is much worse than any internal combustion engine. So when you see these stories about, oh, governments will ban stuff and so on and so forth, it's not that easy. No government will gonna lose money. And of course, you can imagine what happens when people start buying electric cars and this second column starts to decline. They will going to replace this. How are they going to replace this? You won't be allowed to charge your electric car at a residential rate. Anyway, all these concepts bring us to this picture. So this is our world light vehicle, world car fleet outlook by fuel. Up until 2030, it's pretty much the same. So right now, about 80% of the global car fleet is gasoline-driven. By 2030, we still expect 75% to be gasoline. By 2040, it's still 60%. But what you can see is basically there's a pure gasoline peak here around 2030-35, and then the electrification starts. About 10% will be battery electric. Another 20% will be hybridized in a way. But that's it. Not more. Now, this is the fleet outlook, basically. Light vehicles. Let's move to the heavy goods transport, to trucks and so on. You know, this is another topic, with the hot topic, basically, in terms of the electrification. Now, about Tesla truck and so on. So this is a normal diesel truck, okay? You see basically the diesel tank, which is represented with the blue color, 800 liters. That's a Volvo truck, by the way. So that's our base case truck. 800 liters, 1,000 miles range, 20 tons payload. Now, this is the Tesla truck. 1,000 kilowatt-hour battery, range is only, 30% of the normal truck, and payload reduced to 13 ton. Now, this works for some operators, obviously. If you are Walmart, supermarket operator, Pepsi-Cola, and so on, and your job is basically carrying your goods from your central storage facility to the supermarkets and so on, this may be something for you. This may be something for you. But look at this. If you want to increase the range to 600 miles, the battery weighs so much that your payload goes to 7 ton. And if you want to have a truck that has the same range as a diesel truck, that's what happens. Your payload disappears. So basically, you add another trailer behind this truck to pull the load. And that's why we think, basically, that the heavy goods transport, this bit here, will never be electrified. And bear in mind, it's very similar to the bunker market in this aspect. About 20% of the long haul of the diesel trucks are responsible for about 69–70% of the ton miles and the diesel demand. So that's what drives the diesel demand. And this will never happen, and this has only a marginal impact. This brings us, of course, to the other vehicles and so on, and this is one of my favorite charts. It shows you the weight of the battery required to replace the fuel of the tank in all these vehicles. So the bottom circle is relatively easy to electrify. We see these buses, cars, light trucks, and so on. We have seen the trucks. Look at this. If you want to replace the jet fuel in a plane, you need about 10,000 ton weight of battery. VLCC, almost 400,000 tons battery. It's not going to happen. So when you read things like, oh, this X startup has started electric planes and so on, that's not going to happen. Because anybody knows the takeoff weight of a plane, actually, airplane. So Etihad has a lot of A380s. A380 has about 500 tons of takeoff weight. So A380 has 500 tons of takeoff weight. If you want to make it battery, you add 10,000 tons on top of it. It's not going to happen. Let's move to another topic, another hot topic, because this is again the buzz in the press. Oh my God, the mobility is changing and stuff like this. And is it really changing, and what will its impact be? Ride-hailing, Uber and all this type of stuff that will change the world, kill the oil demand, whatever they say. So let me show you this picture. That's me in the Dallas airport. So instead of, I was visiting a client, and instead of taking the shuttle to the hotel with 10 other guests, I ordered a car from Uber, and this came. This is a GMC Yukon XL, a big one, with 18 miles per gallon fuel economy. And they took only me, to the hotel. What do you think was the impact on oil demand if hundreds of thousands of people do this instead of taking the shuttles and buses? You can make up your mind. And that's actually what happens. How does Uber change mobility? Up until now, there wasn't much data available, but now we found actual data from New York municipality. And look at this. On this left chart, you can see the ridership changes between the yellow cabs in New York and the Uber and other ride-hailing companies. Yellow cab ridership goes down, Uber and other companies go up. And what is its net impact actually? Look at this. This line is the sum of these columns. So from 2013-14, it surges. And I'm sorry, it's not really, the legend is cut here, but this is mass transit. And it replaces mass transit. So what Uber does is, in simple words, it takes people off the buses, off the subway, off other mass transit means, and puts them into cars. That's what ride-hailing does. And because the cars are of the majority will be gasoline-driven, it adds to oil demand. We think with our own battery electrification scenario, if the car share and personal transport is sustained, it will add, so it's usually it declines because people tend to use more mass transit, etc. But if it doesn't decline, it adds 200,000 barrels a day of gasoline demand in Europe and 600,000 barrels a day of gasoline demand in the US. That's what Uber does. That's the mobility revolution you read in the paper. Let's jump to another topic, hot topic, China, India. There's a lot talk about Chinese peak demand and stuff like this. That shows you the relationship between the income and the car ownership, again, in China and its peers and the US. Again, US is a little bit just like for demonstration purposes. We don't expect China will go to US also. But look at this. China is now actually trailing right on the Japanese path. I'm sorry. In the long run, we expect China to be more like South Korea rather than Japan. Yeah? But what if? So we have made a couple of scenario analysis for Chinese gasoline demand. So this is our base case China gasoline demand. It's basically growth flattens out due to higher electrification, due to mandated electrification towards 5 million barrels a day. It doesn't reach 5 million barrels a day. So a couple of factors here. If Chinese people with the same fleet and so on just increase their driven miles by 1 percentage point, just 1 percentage point, it adds you about 2 million barrels a day of gasoline demand. If they decrease it by 1 percentage point lower fuel economy, same. 1 percentage point lower mileage cuts about half a million barrels a day demand. A lot of talk is China bans internal combustion engine. If it bans internal combustion engine, nothing really happens until 2035 or so. Of course, this is a little bit depending on the date of this announcement, but still. But what if China goes the Japanese way, as in the previous chart? This happens. Ceteris paribus, everything is left that, everything else left unchanged. It adds about 5 million barrels a day of gasoline demand to China, to our base case. Massive growth potential. Speaking of the fuel economy we have mentioned here, one development recently was Trump administration's revision of the US CAFE standards. We have written a lot of articles of this. Clients of us will remember our flash alerts on this, about how the CAFE standards work, footprint, and so on and so forth. But to analyze this, actually, we made this. So this is our own base case outlook for US new light-duty vehicle fuel economy. Okay, so there's an interruption here for the low oil prices and so on and so forth. But we still expect compliance with CAFE standards to grow. But over the last 3-4 years, US new light-duty vehicle fuel economy hasn't improved, actually, because of higher truck shares, basically. So what happens if actually this trend continues? Because we talked about SUVization, and we said actually this high truck share will prevail. So it is actually not impossible that simply the US fuel economy stops improving. What happens then? This is our US gasoline demand scenario. Base case versus no fuel economy improvement. It adds about 2.5 million barrels a day of gasoline demand at the end of the curve. And remember, we talked about our total oil demand, another 15 million barrels a day, growth flattens out and all this type of stuff. And Feridun said, for example, mentioned that the story is over for gasoline. We talked about this. A lot of this gasoline story is over in the forecasts is actually this US outlook. It's world's largest gasoline consumer, almost 10 million barrels a day. And literally most outlooks see it actually declining strongly. But what if it doesn't? Now this brings me to my last charts, basically. and you can read it. In our view, electrification doesn't play much of a role over the next 10, 15 years. Only after that its impact will be visible. It's the fuel economy improvements that actually are the biggest threat for oil demand. Look at this. This is our gasoline demand forecast, base case. You can see that's what Feridun mentioned, basically, a peak between 2030 and 35. But look at the lost volumes because of fuel economy improvement. By 2040, 13 million barrels a day of lost demand because of fuel economy improvement. And look at the impact of electrification. A third of this. 1/3 of the fuel economy improvement. And the same analysis you can make for the freight diesel. Freight diesel continues growing to grow anyway. I mean, there's no peak there in the truck segment. But still, you lose about 4 million barrels a day of diesel because of fuel economy improvement. And the other factors like natural gas in the truck segment, electrification in the truck segment, don't play a role. So combined, actually, you have about 18 million barrels a day of loss because of fuel economy improvements. 18 million barrels a day because of fuel economy improvements. And this is a big uncertainty because what happens if, for example, the fuel economy improvement is not 1.5% per year, as in our base case, but just 0.5%. 1 percentage point per year less. You end up with 6 million barrels a day of more gasoline demand, 3.3 million barrels a day of more diesel demand by the end of the curve. I'm not saying fuel economy stops improving. It still improves, but at a slower pace. And it gives you almost 10 million barrels a day of additional oil demand by the end of the curve. And this is the biggest uncertainty, not so much the electrification. This is not a big disruption. It's a disruption in the headlines of the media, yes, but not actually in real terms in the oil market. So which brings me to the first slide again with the keywords and so on. So what is real and what are the implications? Our view is this: transport is the biggest driver of demand for at least another 10, 15 years, easily. We are on the verge of a surge in motorization in Asia, in other developing countries as well. Policy is key. Policy is the biggest driver of electrification, not anything else. It's government policy. Percentage versus absolute growth. In terms of oil demand, absolute growth is what matters, not so much the percentage growth. Percentage growth is good for clickbait. Transformation in car industry takes decades. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in 5 years. It takes decades. No meaningful electrification beyond heavy duty. Ride-hailing, Uber increases car mileage and demand. Fuel economy is the biggest threat to oil demand, not electrification, fuel economy. And fuel economy means uncertainty, big uncertainty. And finally, of course, beware the media hype. Feridun has shown the economist slides, so I've taken them out of my presentation, unfortunately. I wanted to finish with them. But that's the main message also. Beware the media hype, don't get carried away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cuneyt. As we've done for the other sessions now, we're going to throw this back at the audience, first of all, and have you answer some questions on the Slido.
Oh, let me contribute as well. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to pull it up myself. Can you pull them up? Okay, so the first one is, what is the most important factor driving electrification? Government policy or subsidies, economics and high pump prices, driving experience, coolness.
What's coolness?
Coolness, like it's a cool car.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
why do you have a Tesla? Feridun has a Tesla, so he might tell us some personal experience here. So, do we have some votes? Government policy subsidies. Cuneyt, you might have steered some votes with your suggestions here. It was a pretty forceful talk. Okay, so we look like we still have some votes coming in. I would actually say in the early days, coolness has been driving a lot of some of it, because the Tesla certainly is, it's sort of a cool car. Okay, personal story, I rode in Faraday's Tesla, and it accelerated so fast the glasses came off my head and hit my son in the back. So, because it goes from 0 to 60 in like 2.5 seconds. So, okay,
So you're the
on
one
to the
saying
next one.
coolness then.
So I'd be the bottom two, maybe. Okay, what will the share of electric cars in a global fleet of 2 billion be by 2040? The share of electric cars. So this would be, it's not sales, it's in the total
It's
fleet.
total
essentially.
fleet, and it
Yeah.
includes battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles.
Yeah,
like
we got to
EV
explain.
plus.
Battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So those are two different categories. The current fleet is about 1.1 billion,
Yes,
right?
total.
And we expect it to grow to about 2 billion. Okay. 25% is what's stated here. What do we have in our estimates? What did you say? What are our estimates?
Together, 20% circa.
About 20% is our estimate? Okay. Okay, so it looks like about 25% is that's about half the votes. Will there be more battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids on the road by 2040?
So just to explain, basic plug-in hybrids are those with an internal combustion engine as well, so it's not only reliant on battery electric. You can charge them, and they have a short range. With like 50 miles or so, you can use electric, but then you switch to the gasoline engine.
So, I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, my parents have one. You plug it in every day, and you can drive, it's about 25 or 30 miles, typically, on electric, and then it switches over to gasoline, as Cuneyt said. So it works for all your local errands, essentially. So what do people think? More plug-in hybrid? Good. Okay, that's about 2/3. Personally, I would agree with this. It doesn't seem like there's as much excitement right now about plug-in hybrids, but it seems like a better solution. It's coming, though. A lot of automobile manufacturers have said they're going to produce plug-in hybrids. Correct, Cuneyt?
Yeah.
Okay, on to the next one. This is the last question. What is the biggest threat for electric vehicles? Low oil or pump prices? Rising battery price? Inadequate charging infrastructure? Or change in government policy? You didn't talk too much about battery prices, by the way, Cuneyt, so we might
No,
have to
not
bring
really,
that up
but-
during the round
But,
table.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, so shift in government policy. Well, thank you everyone for still waiting out. Thank you everyone for voting here. I mean, part of my takeaway of the votes would be that Cuneyt presented an effective case of something because it seemed in line with what you were saying. Maybe can I offer just one or two takeaways here, and then turn it over to you, Faraday, and then we'll go to the audience. I mean, one thing that's interesting to me here with the, obviously, we're presenting a case that electric vehicles can come, but it's very much overhyped right now in terms of the impact and the speed. I think what's interesting in the background, if you're an oil producer, it's actually in some ways an oil producer and a refiner. It's actually in some ways good that it's overhyped in the sense that it almost certainly is putting pressure on the perceptions of long-run oil prices. You know, we talked before about the back of the forward curve being in the 50s still. People are testing long-run, conventional projects still at pretty low price levels, which means that investment will lag as long as you think that electric vehicles are a threat, and then you essentially, the market gets surprised. You don't have enough oil down the road if this continues, okay? The other thing is also in refining. We know for a fact that in for example, in India, there's government officials that will tell IOC, why are you building a big refinery if we're going to go all electric? I mean, that seems pretty stupid to put all this money in. We've heard that from politicians. And actually in China, one of the NOCs certainly is of the view that demand will stop growing, and they're getting more and more anti-refinery construction, which again, if you're in the refinery business and other people don't build refineries for what may be a false threat, that is good for your business in the near term. So it might be a strange way to think about it, but in some ways it can be helpful. Ferdinand, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think just a word that, you've had all these announcements that different countries will stop allowing any combustion engine vehicles to be built by 2030 or 40. I think we've had the German announcement, the French announcement, the British announcement, even India has announced the same. But it's very important to note that actually what they say is that we will not allow combustion engine only to be built. None of them say that you cannot build anything which has combustion engine. It's combustion engine only. So basically plug-in hybrids would be okay as with combustion engine. And so this is often misunderstood by the press, that they say that these statements means that 100% has to be electric vehicles. That is not true. In almost every announcement, if you read the fine print, it allows for plug-in hybrid with a combustion engine in it. So we can't just translate the headlines into actual policies. And as I said, in this case, every single case is combustion engine only, not combustion engine at all. So there's still be combustion engine being built. And of course, those who build the combustion engines, the cars will last 20, 30 years. So they will be still in the market and still very dominating in terms of the total vehicles on the market. So these are the comments. Cuneyt made a sort of detailed presentation. Jeff made the comments. We'd like to open this up for open discussion. And if you want to disagree, perfectly feel free to do so. If you have anything that you want to add, please add. If you want Cuneyt to ask any more questions, please do so. So the floor is open.
There must be a critique of that.
Somebody must disagree. Okay.
T.S. Dora again from my question is, I think we are talking about replacing the combustion engine cars with electric vehicles, whether it's going to happen or not going to happen. But worldwide, are the governments not supposed to focus more on reducing the total number of cars on the road, rather than looking at it whether electric vehicle is the solutions? Because before you go to electric vehicles, the decarbonization of the fuel mix, which is essentially going to produce the power which gets into the car, that is more important. So, because at the end of the day, you can't, to have so many cars running on the road, you need to have more roads. Is it possible that, is it a sustainable development that you keep on building the roads and you never are able to meet the demand? Because the moment the roads come, the roads get again full. And you are actually getting into, so is it a smart solutions to get into, this whole concept of, whether electric vehicles is going to replace? My second feeling is, there is actually a lobby of the combustion engine lobby, which is not going to allow the electric vehicles to come very soon. If you actually, the road minister, Mr. Nitin Gadkari of India, when he announced that by 2030, you'll have 100% electric vehicles, or he said that, look, I'm going to thrust it on the automobile manufacturers to ensure that they produce only electric vehicles. He received a lot of backlash, especially because you've got the ancillary units, and it's got the normal cars have got so many car parts, and which is going to reduce significantly with electric vehicles. So a lot of jobs are going to disappear. So these are the two fundamental challenges, in my opinion, to the whole concept of the electric vehicles.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. So the most ideal way for governments will be basically, yeah, reduce the car usage overall. So more mass transit, it's more environmental friendly, reduces the carbon usage, reduces the oil demand, and so on. So basically putting people more into the mass transit. But you see what happens with all the ride-hailing and Uber. It's going the other way around. And and with building the roads, it's the same. Yeah, that's called the induced demand in the transport sector. Yeah, the more roads you build, basically, the more people fill in the roads. So you increase at the end of the day, it gives you maybe a little bit comfortable couple of years, but after a couple of years, these roads are congested as well. So this is how it's going to happen. Yes, but on the other side, you have to consider the people's choices and people's aspirations and desires as well. So the only way out of this is basically, as I told it, basically, it's a ban. What are you going to do, basically, in India, telling people you are not allowed to buy cars? It's impossible. When people get more money, of course, they aspire to a certain living standard, and car owning or driving, being able to drive a car is one of these things. And that's, yeah, I consider this a little bit, c'est la vie, so is life. And the government should basically try to control or divert these consumer choices and so on if they want to go so. And I totally agree, pedestrianizing inner cities, that's a big thing. In London, for example, Oxford Street is going to be pedestrianized up until 2021. It will be marvelous. I agree with this. But the main thing is, of course, Oxford Street versus the whole London. It's just a drop on a hot stone, basically. And the other question is about the car lobby also. I mean, I don't know, it's basically another industry. And they have the same interests as any other industry, so they defend their interests as any other industry do. Back in the day, we made actually an analysis about comparing the employment in the European car industry versus the European refining industry, because Europe is a diesel importer, and the car manufacturers are very diesel focused, actually. And the car employment is like 20 times higher than the refinery employment or something like this. So this gives them obviously a much bigger leverage against politicians. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's just another industry defending its own interests.
Can I just also say that, actually, you said that Indian government said that after 2030, electric cars. That is not true. They said again, no combustion engine only. They,
Initially, they came up with this statement. I think there was a lot of backlash, and they changed the statement. But the initial statement was they will do.
I think perhaps the minister who said it misunderstood the whole story. But, it's also important to explain that today the lobby of electric cars and renewable energy is a very strong lobby. In the Washington, D.C., in the U.S., where you can actually measure and count the lobbyists for solar are 5 times bigger than the lobbyists of the oil industry. The lobbyists for electric cars are as big as the lobbyists or those who are against it. So those who lobby for renewable energy, clean energy, they have actually used the moral high ground. That you people who want to continue the same old way, you want to kill the children. And they actually have the moral high ground. They can collect more money from a lot of people for their lobbying efforts. So it is remarkable that in the US, the solar, 5 times bigger than the oil industry in terms of budget and in terms of people. So please don't always assume that these guys have incredible lobby power, because they are actually, some of them are embarrassed about where they are. They don't want to exaggerate their own efforts, because the moral high ground is in the hands of those who are against them and tell them that they are destroying the future of the children. Jeff?
I was just going to add, and Cuneyt will correct me if I'm wrong here, though. We come up with a lot of these anecdotal examples around the world, but at the end of the day, the main way we can be wrong is if China somehow moves real aggressively. Because the Chinese are now selling almost as many cars as US and Europe combined, right? And they've occasionally come out and changed policy related to electric vehicles. So if they somehow go and surprise us, and not just say things, right? It has to be China oftentimes puts out a lot of targets and various different things that they'll say, but then occasionally they put out something that has real teeth in it, and that can transform the industry. And so we really have to pay attention to their industry, and there's probably a couple things to observe there, I would say. They're going very much in the direction of battery electric vehicles, not plug-in hybrids, right? Because that's partly because they have that technology better. It tends to be very focused around a government development policy rather than just purely an electric vehicle policy. They want to develop sort of local companies. But all the big manufacturers now, you look at GM, Mercedes, all these guys, when they think about electric vehicles, they're really focusing on China. They're putting their development centers, everything. So again, if the way we would get shocked, that's the part of the world to watch.
Yeah, correct. David, is it?
Yes, please. Yeah.
My name is Taimur Khan. I'm with Hascol Petroleum, Karachi, Pakistan. I wanted to know if you have a view on hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles, and would that have any impact on the vehicle fleet? Because I believe Honda is looking at that quite aggressively. Thank you.
Yeah, basically, our view on hydrogen is, I would say, relatively conservative. With hydrogen, it's on the paper, it's the ideal fuel, really. But in real life, you multiply every challenge you have on the battery electric vehicle side with a factor. That's why we don't see it actually happening over the next decades or so. It will be really minuscule. And if you look at the producers,
activity has died outside of Japan. I mean, outside of Japan, all the activity.
Nothing is going on.
That's what I want to say. So if you look at the manufacturers, there are really two companies who are pushing it actually. I mean, the biggest pusher is Toyota, of course, and then Honda has also a fuel cell model, Clariant or something like this. The issue is, of course, this is another uncertainty. We are trailing them, we are watching them, and I always give the example in 1990 when the first Toyota Prius came out. Everybody laughed at them. Really, everybody laughed at them. Everybody laughed at the car. It was nobody thought it's possible. But look at where they are now. World's largest hybrid producer. So Japanese companies have, Fairdown is, I'm not the expert here, Fairdown is the expert, but they have a different approach to long-term thinking than the Americans or than the Europeans, for example. So they are slowly cooking this thing, the hydrogen, but who knows, in 20 years maybe they will be again, world leaders in hydrogen, and the world will look at Japanese, oh my God, that's actually so amazing, let's go hydrogen. But again, this will not happen before 20, 25, 30 years actually, on a mass scale.
Would there, please?
I think David had his hand up too.
Yeah.
Dave and David and
Two Davids, you know.
two Davids and the Midi over there too.
Thanks. Dave Bernsberger from Platt. So thanks for the presentation. It was some really interesting data in there and some good thinking, especially because, as you said, there's been so much hype around this. So I had two quick questions. One actually inspired by the hydrogen question just now. It used to be the case that CNG was being talked about as a big displacer of gasoline demand. And I was just wondering, in your demand charts there, did CNG feature, or is that kind of a...
Yeah, that was in the other group there, basically. So if you look at the fleet chart there, it was in the other groups.
It's in the other groups,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, so it's still a feature, but a smaller one.
It's
Yeah.
small
It's the math
feature.
is that who is going to subsidize it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and very good. Thank you. And then the other question I had was the second of two. So, what kind of displacement figure do you tend to use for EVs and hybrids coming into the fleet in terms of how many barrels a day of gasoline demand are displaced by EVs and hybrids? Sometimes I hear like for every million vehicles, it's about 30,000 barrels a day of gasoline demand. So every million EVs replaces 30,000 KBD of gasoline. But I'm curious what kind of number you guys are using when you do some of the destruction
You had it
numbers.
in the last chart, basically. So the electrification with the total electrification with the hybrids and BEVs will replace about 4.5 million barrels a day of gasoline.
I think he's looking for some number.
Ballpark number.
That's how many vehicles?
1 million battery electric vehicles, depends on the battery electric vehicle model as well, but replace about 20 to 30,000 barrels a day of oil.
230,000?
20 to 30,000.
20 to 30,000.
1 million replaces 20 to 30,000 barrels a day.
Okay, similar to what you were hearing. Yeah.
Where's the microphone?
So
Oh, and if you have another mic, Mehdi over there also had a
Thank you.
question.
Yeah, a great presentation. And a couple of points I wanted to make, and excuse me if you already made the point in the presentation, I may have missed part of it. But the electric vehicle issue, I think, is potentially another example of governments selecting technologies. And in Europe, we've had experience of that with diesel. And the overall record of governments actually picking winners in terms of technology isn't a terrific one. And a lot of studies from the auto industry and from the oil industry suggest, and I think someone made this point yesterday on the panel yesterday, is that in terms of offsetting the growth in hydrocarbon demand in transport between now and 2040, you probably get 4 or 5 times the bang for the buck from efficiency gains than you get from changing fuel form or drive system. And therefore, if the policy is, partially replacing hydrocarbon, it's efficiency, and that doesn't have to be an electric vehicle, it doesn't have to be a hybrid, doesn't have to be a hydrogen vehicle or a gas vehicle. It can be the next generation of, most importantly, lighter internal combustion engines. Now, the likelihood is we need all of those, and all of them will play a role. But in terms of net, you're going to get much more reduction in gasoline or diesel use by 2040 from efficiency gains than you're getting from pure
I think
electrification.
he showed this already. Can you go back to show it?
Sorry.
Efficiency gains compared to electric cars?
can you put on the slide back? Sorry, can I put on the slides back? But yeah, in general, I totally agree. The fuel economy impact is much bigger, much easier to achieve. And the thing is, with your government policy, I cannot say it better, really. I mean, governments should not choose technology over outcome. They should basically give the outcome and whatever technology. Okay. Okay, back. Yes. Yeah, so this is it basically, exactly. So for freight diesel and road gasoline.
This is exactly what he showed.
And that's what you mentioned basically. Yeah. So for gasoline, for example, this orange bit will be achieved by fuel economy, and that's by electrification. So it's much more easier, the bigger factor basically, much bigger factor.
So, the point of that figure is that if the fleet, if you kept buying cars the same as in 2016, if the type of vehicle was held constant, it would grow a lot faster. Right?
Yeah, we grow a lot. We will
You'd grow at the top of those
Yeah, we will
bars.
end up here basically.
Yeah.
Okay, take the microphone over there. Hello? This guy is asleep. Can somebody else take the mic? He's asleep. Over there.
No, we have it already. Oh, there as well.
Can I speak?
Yeah. Please go
My
on.
name is Abdurrahman Al-Hassani. I'm from Madnuk Refining. Thank you for this deep, informative presentation. I think you have covered all the angles of the electric car. Just would like to share with you recently, I've seen the Uber is affecting the EV strategy. And recently, the US government have put the new regulations and very stringent regulations in the company. And I think they have slowly, they're losing their market, and they're changing actually their business type also. So could you shed some light on this, if you have any background in this?
To be frank with you, I don't have really a man, but in London, for example, the London municipality has revoked Uber's license, but weirdly they are still operating. So they don't have license, but if I open my app in London, there are still Uber cars going around, and if I want to have one, it comes. So basically, yeah, it will be a policy clash, and you have all these fights between taxi operators and Uber drivers and everywhere, basically. But overall, it's again, it fits the consumer choice. That's the main problem. It's very convenient. You go out of your whatever the government policy is, it will find a way. That's my view, basically, because you go out of your house, take your phone, open a car, it comes, and you go.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. What was the question?
We answered.
You already answered.
If the government policies will basically, stop the expansion of companies like Uber and so on, and or be
Okay.
detrimental.
All right. Okay, there was a question. Mehdi had a question?
Mehdi's waiting patiently over there.
Go over there. No,
The other corner.
go to the wrong direction.
Yeah, I have one.
Oh, there's another. Okay.
Hello?
Give it to him over there. Yes, just we go in order of the people who raise their hands.
Sorry, mine is more sociological. If the oil reserves move to the battery, did you start to look into what happens to the second-hand market? So you looked at the earnings and the link or the correlation with the number of cars per capita. But then we also know that many buy second-hand cars, and we don't have enough data on electric vehicles because the battery is worth more than.
That's Jeff's favorite question, I guess. I mean, you always talk about second-hand electric cars and what will happen to them. And
If you have a Tesla and you want to sell it, nobody will buy it.
Is it? Are you that firm on the answer?
You would have to sell it at a third of half the price after a year. This market for second-hand market has not developed in electric cars yet. It will develop in time.
Can I? My parents looked at buying a Tesla in California. This is a personal example, but there aren't that many examples. They said that they looked at one. It was $50,000. It was $140 initially. I think it was a 5-year-old Tesla, so it seemed like a pretty steep depreciation there. So
For hybrid cars, it's no problem. That already has been accepted in the market. But if I want to buy a used Tesla, within 2 or 3 years, everything changes so rapidly.
Yeah.
I'd rather wait and buy a new one, because by the time I get it, it's already obsolete. The changes are so dramatic there that sort of second-hand buying is very sort of kind of a market which is very, very hard to develop.
a related question. I mean, Cuneyt, maybe you can speak a little bit around the issues related to battery life. That's been a challenge, right, in terms of performance and deterioration there?
Well, that's why the market has actually not developed really as well. Not only because there aren't much cars, but also the uncertainties are a little bit big. So it's not like with the gasoline car. You buy a 5-year-old gasoline car. It has pretty much the same it has pretty much the same power and the same range. But the electric car, it can be really detrimental. Recently, actually, there was a study from Australia, I think, or New Zealand, I don't remember, about the Nissan Leaf battery degradation. And literally it goes like this. Nissan Leaf is one car which doesn't have thermal battery management in it. And this type of small things actually make a huge difference. So if you don't have a thermal battery management, for example, after a couple of years, your battery is only 80% capacity, etc. So, but this affects obviously the second-hand market as well.
I think there was
one.
Yes, there is one here, Dr. Michael Berthaud from ADNOC Refining. I have a question regarding the life cycle assessment of electrical car. Yesterday, in Mr. Omar San's presentation, he shown that finally, if you are using a gas plant to generate the electricity, there is absolutely no environmental benefits from the electrical car compared to ICE vehicles. Do you have some hints?
So in our study, we have basically made this analysis for US power generation mix, EU power generation mix, and China power generation mix. And there are, based on different cars, of course, I mean, if you have a small electric car like Renault Zoe, the break-even point comes closer. And if you have a big electric car like Tesla and compare it with a 7 Series BMW or so, It happens later. But the main problem is with gas, for example, it happens, I don't remember with gas, but in the US electricity mix, for example, or in the EU electricity mix, with the big cars, you have to go really 70,000, 80,000 kilometers until you reach the break-even point.
Cuneyt, you might have to explain what you mean by the break-even
Oh
point.
yeah, so basically the CO2, overall life cycle CO2 emissions from the gasoline car and the overall life cycle CO2 emissions from the electric car, including production and the usage on the road, they break even. And if you do this actually in China, and this is actually one of the biggest things, inconsistencies in the Chinese policy. In China, where 2/3 of the electric generation is coal-based, electric cars are never better than internal combustion engine cars. But of course, there are other aspects like air pollution in the cities, so you externalize the pollution, you take it elsewhere outside the cities. That's their motivation, basically, and cutting the oil import dependency as well to some extent. But in terms of the life cycle CO2 emissions, it never works.
So a part of the key here is that building the electric cars and the batteries is quite CO2 intensive.
Yeah.
So you start out negative with the car, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You're worse off with an electric car at the start, and then you have to play catch up depending on what type of fuel you're using.
I have a second question. You have shown that the Uber effect is an increase in the gasoline consumption. Do you think we might have the same effect with autonomous car?
Technically, I think it might have, sorry, I'm just trying to find the slide. So, yeah, so technically, it has the same impact, yes, because it makes it easier for people to get into cars. So if you are somebody sitting in a wheelchair, for example, who cannot, get in a car, if you are somebody who cannot afford a car but use the mass transit usually, now with autonomous cars, actually, you will be able to use cars. I mean, not drive yourself, but travel in cars. So that will have the same impact as well. But from the technical aspect of it, the autonomization of car makes actually more sense if the car is full electric. So that's actual thing. So we have now, right now, we have autonomous cars with internal combustion engines, like as the accident that happened recently in the US, for example, that Volvo Jeep. But overall, in the long run, it will be more electric cars, the autonomous vehicles. But the concept is the same, yes. It will take people off the mass transit, put them into cars. At the end of the day, you will end up with more cars on the road, more mileage, more congestion. Mike.
Yes, hello. Michael Barry from FGE. I'm very familiar with Cuneyt's presentations, obviously, and there's one aspect which we didn't emphasize too much in this one, though we put it in a lot of other charts that we show, and it's pulling some strands together. I mean, it's almost a comment rather than a question, but I just want to emphasize that I think, from all this, one of the most important drivers, which Cuneyt just mentioned, is actually social change or social aspiration. And one example, obviously, is the sheer growth in car ownership we're expecting. How is that, is that going to change? It's unlikely to slow down. The other one, which is a chart we have elsewhere, actually, which is very interesting, I think, the SUV factor, that, of course, with you're getting far more SUVs coming on the road, they are heavier. And even though they're getting more fuel efficient, of course, that's a contrary factor, that these vehicles are heavier. So their fuel economy actually may not be improving so much. And it also leads on to the question, how do you make cars lighter? You probably have to use plastics. What does that mean? More petrochemical demand. Yeah. So all these little strands all add together and point more to the upside on oil demand than downside. I don't know if you want to add anything, actually.
No, that's correct, actually. That's actually a very important point. So the fuel economy gains in the cars enacted by the governments and so on, they will be one way to reach them, obviously, to make the cars lighter. And how do you make the cars lighter? Instead of steel, you use aluminum, or you increase the plastic share in a car. And that's the problem. So with all this car motorization rate in our outlook, for example, the plastic demand from the car industry will actually surge. What does this mean for the oil refiners? It's more demand for petrochemicals, basically.
And actually, sorry, just to follow up on the social change point, I just forgot it. The other thing about the China SUV story, of course, is that it again comes back to social aspiration or change. the reason people are buying more and more SUVs in China, it's a rather strange and peculiar reason, is that they have to go into a lottery in a lot of cities and a waiting list to get a car, just to get a car. And when they get one, what do? You go out and buy the biggest and best possible because it's your only chance. So that's part of the reason SUV sales are soaring in China.
Salah Al-Hanizi from KBC. Well, I totally agree what Mr. Davis just said about changing from the heavy vehicle to the lighter. And I think the big impact of this electrical vehicle will be not in the oil sector, it will be in the metal industry itself. Yeah. It will be lighter and will be good news for the oil sector to use. Yeah. Are you agreeing with this thing?
Yes, but again, this is one point, a very good point actually. Same with the plastics. This interconnections between the different industries and how they actually impact the oil demand is a very interesting thing which we are looking at basically in our analysis. As you said, for example, more aluminum, more metals, more plastics, everything actually impacts the oil industry. More plastics means more petrochemicals. How do you produce more aluminum, more metals? How do you get the raw materials from mines to the processing grounds? With ships, with trucks, they run on diesel, they run on fuel oil. So all of these things actually drive the oil economy. Let me give you a very interesting example. Wind energy. So we have seen a couple of really good analyses about the windmills and the wind energy and so on. The biggest material used in a windmill is steel. How do you produce steel? Iron ore from mine, you carry it in a truck, diesel-driven, to the port, put it into a ship from Africa, which runs on fuel oil, goes to China, being operated. You need a lot of heat. What you use, either coal or petcoke. And then you produce steel. And then make windmill out of it. And this interconnection between different energy types and how these renewable energies actually drive the oil demand is a fascinating area of research, really. And we are looking more and more into this, and I'm really getting excited when I look at this. Oh my God, this is the impact of one windmill actually causes this much of oil demand increase. It's incredible stories there. So that's, yeah.
Okay, I think we've hit our time limit here. I think this has been quite interesting. People often ask me who lead the various services that we have. I didn't mention at the beginning, Cuneyt leads our strategic long-term outlook, and you can tell from how he's speaking about the market, that's a passion of his. So if you do subscribe to that and you find parts in there that are interesting or you want to critique, you now know who to either praise or yell at, depending on what you think about it, okay? So a couple announcements before we close here. We would be grateful if you we'd be grateful if you can make the following announcements, okay? So we got that. Delegates are kindly reminded to complete and hand in their evaluation forms to the MPGC event team. Okay, so please make sure you fill it out. It helps us get an idea of what to do in following years and what to improve. Second, and probably the most interesting one here, is Market View would like to announce the winner of the iPad before we break for coffee. So someone is going to get an iPad, and I don't know who is going to make this announcement. Oh, here we go. Please take the mic. Oh, there we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. The raffle, this lovely iPad, is won by Aisha Almore from ADNOC. Oh, okay.
Does she have to be here to win?
I'll give it to Hashem. I'm sure he'll pass it on to her and take his cut.
Are you sure you're going to give it to her?
Thank you very much, everyone.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Okay, and can we also thank Cuneyt for his presentation? Thanks, Cuneyt. Okay, it's coffee time.
Come back at 4 o'clock, please.